You're too slow, too old, and frankly too soft for this program, ma'am. Maybe you should stick to desk work where you belong." Cadet Jackson's voice carried across the entire training yard at Thunderhawk Military Academy as Professor Diane Reeves stood motionless, watching 23 young cadets snicker behind their hands. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the obstacle course that stretched before them like a concrete and steel nightmare. What none of these cocky 18-year-olds knew was that in exactly 47 minutes their entire world would be turned upside down when a convoy of black vehicles would screech into the academy demanding one person by name, the same washed-up old lady they were currently mocking. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Diane Reeves was 52 years old, gray streaks threading through her auburn hair, wearing the standard academy instructor uniform that hung slightly loose on her seemingly frail frame. For 8 months, she'd been the target of whispered jokes and eye rolls from the cadets at Thunderhawk Military Academy in northern Colorado. "She's ancient," they'd mutter during weapons training, "probably never even held a real gun." Why did they hire a grandmother to teach us combat tactics? The young recruits, fresh out of high school and bursting with testosterone-fueled confidence, couldn't fathom learning anything valuable from someone who looked like she should be baking cookies instead of preparing them for warfare. Cadet Rodriguez leaned over to his buddy Thompson during morning formation. "I heard she used to work at some community college before this, probably taught art history or something equally useless." They both snickered, loud enough for Diane to hear as she called out commands for the day's training schedule. She never responded to their taunts, never raised her voice, never asserted her authority the way their other instructors did. To them, her quiet demeanor confirmed every assumption they'd made about her weakness. The Academy's commanding officer, Colonel Patterson, had initially been skeptical about Diane's appointment himself. "We need someone who can push these kids," he'd told the board of directors, "someone who commands respect through presence alone." But the board had insisted, citing her impressive resume and unique qualifications. Patterson remained unconvinced, especially watching how easily the cadets walked all over her during drills. But there were subtle things, tiny details that most people missed entirely. The way Diane's eyes constantly scanned the perimeter during outdoor training, like she was calculating distances and escape routes. How she never sat with her back to a door during briefings. The fact that when equipment malfunctioned or training scenarios went wrong, she always seemed to know exactly what to do, issuing quiet suggestions that somehow fixed everything perfectly. And her hands calloused in very specific places, not from office work or teaching theory, but from something else entirely. Cadet Williams, slightly more observant than his peers, had noticed these oddities. One afternoon during a tactical simulation, when the GPS system failed and everyone was lost in the Colorado wilderness, Diane had calmly pointed them in the right direction using only the sun's position and some natural landmarks. Lucky guess, the other cadets had dismissed, but Williams wondered how someone who'd supposedly never seen real combat could navigate like a seasoned field operative. This particular morning's training was focused on the Academy's legendary obstacle course, a brutal circuit called the Gauntlet that had broken the spirits of countless cadets over the years. Rope climbs, wall scaling, mud crawls under barbed wire, balance beams, tire runs, and a final sprint that left even the fittest recruits gasping for air. The Academy record stood at 4 minutes and 37 seconds, set by a Marine instructor 3 years prior. "All right, ladies," barked Sergeant Mitchell, the Academy's head physical training instructor. "Today you're going to show Professor Reeves here what real military conditioning looks like." He gestured dismissively toward Diane, who stood quietly at the edge of the course with her clipboard. Maybe she'll learn something about what it takes to be a warrior. The cadets formed up at the starting line, stretching and psyching themselves up for the challenge. Jackson, the most vocal of Diane's critics, made sure to position himself where she could hear his commentary. "Watch this, Professor," he called out mockingly. "This is how soldiers actually move." His friends laughed, feeding off his arrogance. Diane simply nodded politely, making notes on her clipboard as if their taunts were just background noise. She'd heard it all before, every variation of "too old," "too weak," "doesn't belong here." What they didn't know, what none of them could possibly comprehend, was that she'd completed obstacle courses that made the gauntlet look like a children's playground. Courses designed by special operations units where failure meant more than just embarrassment. It meant death. As the first wave of cadets launched into the course, grunting and struggling through each obstacle, Diane watched with the analytical eye of someone who'd seen true physical excellence. These kids were fit, sure, but they moved with the inefficient enthusiasm of youth rather than the calculated precision of experience. They wasted energy, took unnecessary risks, let their egos drive their movements instead of their tactical minds. The fastest cadet completed the course in 6 minutes and 43 seconds, respectable for a trainee but nowhere near Academy record pace. Jackson finished third, breathing hard but immediately seeking out Diane's reaction. "Not bad for an old-timer like me, right, Professor?" he panted sarcastically. "Think you could keep up?" The other cadets erupted in laughter. The idea of their soft-spoken, middle-aged instructor attempting the gauntlet was beyond ridiculous to them. It was like imagining their grandmother trying to bench press a truck. Diane looked up from her clipboard, her expression unreadable. For just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes. Not anger or hurt, but something else entirely. Something that might have given the cadets pause if they'd been paying attention. Instead, they were too busy celebrating their perceived superiority to notice that their weak instructor had just made a decision that would change everything. What none of them knew was that Diane had been watching them struggle through obstacles she could complete, blindfolded. What they couldn't see was that every quiet correction she'd offered, every tactical suggestion they'd dismissed, came from someone who'd trained the people who trained their instructors. And what they definitely couldn't predict was that their mockery was about to be interrupted by the arrival of some very serious people who would make them question everything they thought they knew about the unassuming woman they'd been tormenting for months. The stage was set, the trap was laid, and in less than an hour, these cocky young cadets would learn that the most dangerous warriors are often the ones who don't need to prove anything to anyone. The first crack in their assumptions came during weapons maintenance class 3 weeks earlier. Cadet Stevens had been struggling to reassemble his M4 carbine after cleaning, the pieces scattered across his workstation like a mechanical puzzle he couldn't solve. He'd been fumbling with the bolt carrier group for 10 minutes, sweat beading on his forehead as other cadets snickered at his incompetence. Professor Reeves had been walking the rows, quietly observing. As she passed Stevens's station, she paused and watched him attempting to force the bolt into the wrong position. "Try rotating it 15 degrees counterclockwise first," she said softly, almost casually. "The gas key alignment needs to match the chamber extension before the cam pin will seat properly." Stevens looked at her with confusion but followed her instruction. The weapon clicked together perfectly in seconds. He stared at the assembled rifle, then at Diane, wondering how a supposed academic knew the precise mechanical specifications that even Sergeant Mitchell sometimes had to reference in the manual. "Lucky guess," whispered Cadet Torres to his neighbor, but the neighbor, Cadet Nash, wasn't so sure. He'd watched Professor Reeves's eyes during the exchange. She hadn't been guessing. She'd been looking at that rifle like a craftsman examining a familiar tool. The second incident occurred during a night navigation exercise in the Pine Valley Wilderness area surrounding Thunderhawk Academy. The cadets had been dropped off in teams of 4 with basic compasses and maps, tasked with reaching 3 checkpoint stations before dawn. It was designed to be challenging but manageable for first-year trainees. Cadet Morrison's team had gotten completely turned around in the darkness, their confidence evaporating as unfamiliar terrain stretched endlessly in every direction. They'd been wandering in circles for 2 hours when they heard footsteps approaching through the underbrush. Expecting Sergeant Mitchell or another instructor coming to rescue them, they were surprised when Professor Reeves emerged from the tree line. "Lost?" she asked matter-of-factly, though it was obvious from their panicked expressions that they were. "We can't figure out where we are," Morrison admitted reluctantly. "The compass readings don't match what we're seeing on the map." Diane studied their position for exactly 30 seconds, her eyes scanning the horizon in a systematic pattern that Morrison would later describe as weird, like she was reading invisible signs in the air. Then she pointed northeast. "Checkpoint Alpha is 1.2 miles that direction. Follow the drainage ditch until you hit the fire break, then due north for 300 meters. Checkpoint Bravo is southwest from your current position. You'll see the radio tower reflection off the reservoir if you climb that ridge." She gestured to a barely visible slope in the darkness. The team followed her directions and found both checkpoints with pinpoint accuracy. When they compared notes with other teams later, they discovered that Professor Reeves had somehow navigated the wilderness more precisely than their GPS units. Morrison kept the detail to himself initially, but couldn't stop thinking about the confidence in her voice. Not the tentative tone of someone making educated guesses, but the absolute certainty of someone who'd navigated hostile territory many times before. The third anomaly happened during first aid training. Cadet Parker had volunteered to be the victim for a simulated combat injury scenario, complete with fake blood and theatrical groaning. The other cadets were supposed to practice battlefield triage under pressure, while instructors shouted commands and created chaos to simulate combat conditions. But the simulation went wrong when Parker, getting too enthusiastic with his acting, slipped on the fake blood and genuinely dislocated his shoulder. His screams of real pain cut through the exercise as his arm bent at an unnatural angle. While the other cadets froze in shock and Sergeant Mitchell fumbled for his radio to call medical services, Professor Reeves moved. Not hurried, not panicked, but with fluid precision that seemed almost choreographed. She was beside Parker in 3 steps, her hands already assessing his injury, with movements so practiced they appeared automatic. "Anterior dislocation, likely no fracture based on the angle," she said calmly, her fingers probing specific points around Parker's shoulder joint. "Parker, I need you to breathe and relax your muscles completely. This will hurt for about 10 seconds, then the pain will stop." Before anyone could protest or call for proper medical personnel, she had positioned Parker's arm and executed a perfect reduction technique. There was an audible pop. Parker gasped once, and then his face flooded with relief as the intense pain vanished. How did you know how to do that?" Parker asked, rotating his shoulder experimentally. "Basic anatomy," Diane replied quietly, but Cadet Williams had been close enough to watch her technique. His father was an orthopedic surgeon, and Williams had spent enough time in medical facilities to recognize professional-level procedure when he saw it. What Professor Reeves had just performed wasn't basic anatomy, it was advanced emergency medicine, executed with the confidence of someone who'd done it dozens of times under pressure. The fourth incident was the most telling, though only 2 cadets witnessed it. During an evening equipment check, Cadets Foster and Cruz had stayed late, to finish organizing the armory after a particularly chaotic training session. They were in the back storage room when they heard voices from the main weapons area. "Completely unacceptable performance today," Colonel Patterson was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "Half these cadets couldn't hit a barn door if they were standing inside it. The marksmanship scores are embarrassing." "Sir, if I may suggest a modification to the training protocol," came Professor Reeves's voice, clear and confident in a way the cadets had never heard before. "The issue isn't their aim. It's their breathing technique and trigger discipline. They're anticipating recoil instead of following through. If you adjust the training sequence to emphasize breath control and natural point of aim before introducing speed elements, you'll see immediate improvement." Foster and Cruz exchanged glances. This wasn't the hesitant, soft-spoken professor they knew. This was someone speaking with absolute technical authority. "The current curriculum focuses too heavily on volume of fire," she continued. "In real combat situations, precision trumps speed every time. One well-placed shot is worth 20 rounds sprayed in the general direction of a target." "And I suppose you have experience with real combat situations?" Patterson's voice carried a skeptical edge. There was a long pause. When Professor Reeves spoke again, her voice had returned to its usual quiet tone. "I've read extensively about it, sir. Academic research." But Foster, who had exceptional hearing, caught something else in that pause. He heard the faint sound of what might have been a bitter laugh, quickly suppressed. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Maintenance worker Henry Kowalski had been employed at Thunderhawk Academy for 15 years, long enough to have seen dozens of instructors come and go. He was invisible to most staff and cadets, just the old guy who fixed broken equipment and cleaned the facilities after hours. But Henry noticed things others missed, and he'd become increasingly curious about Professor Reeves, not because of anything dramatic, but because of tiny behavioral details that reminded him of his own military service in Vietnam. She always backed into parking spaces, a habit common among people trained to be ready for quick escapes. She unconsciously checked the time every 7 minutes during classes, like someone accustomed to regular radio check-ins. When thunder rumbled overhead during storms, her shoulders would tense for just a moment before she consciously relaxed them. Most telling was what Henry observed during a routine fire drill. While everyone else filed out through the designated exits in orderly fashion, Professor Reeves had automatically positioned herself near the rear of the group, constantly scanning behind them as if watching for threats. It was subtle, almost unconscious, but Henry recognized the protective instinct of someone trained to be the last one out, the one who makes sure everyone else gets to safety first. Henry had seen enough combat veterans to recognize the signs, even when they were carefully hidden. Professor Reeves moved through the world like someone who'd learned to expect danger from any direction, someone who'd been trained to notice everything and react to threats before they fully materialized. But when he tried to share his observations with others, they dismissed him. "She's just a college professor, Henry. You're seeing things that aren't there." Even when he pointed out specific behaviors, people found innocent explanations. She backed into parking spaces because it was easier to leave quickly after long teaching days. She checked the time because she had a tight schedule. She watched for threats during fire drills because she was naturally cautious. The cadets, especially, refused to see anything that might challenge their perception of Professor Reeves as weak and irrelevant. They had too much invested in their superior attitude to consider that they might be fundamentally wrong about her, but the signs were there for anyone willing to look beyond surface appearances. The question wasn't whether Professor Diane Reeves was hiding something. It was what exactly she was hiding, and why someone with her obvious skills was content to let a group of teenage cadets treat her like an incompetent amateur. That question would be answered sooner than anyone expected, in a way that would shatter every assumption they'd made about the quiet woman who'd been watching them with the patient eyes of a predator pretending to be prey. The harassment reached its peak during the third week of October when Cadet Jackson decided that Professor Reeves needed to be put in her place once and for all. It started small, whispered comments during formations that grew progressively louder, deliberately slow responses to her instructions, and the kind of calculated disrespect that walks right up to the line of insubordination without technically crossing it. "Ma'am, with all due respect," Jackson said during tactical theory class, his voice dripping with false politeness, "don't you think someone with actual field experience should be teaching us about combat formations?" The other cadets erupted in barely contained snickers. Diane simply nodded and continued with her lesson on squad movement patterns, but Jackson wasn't finished. "I mean, how can you teach us about something you've never actually done?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. 23 pairs of young eyes watched to see how their supposedly weak instructor would handle this direct confrontation. Diane paused at the whiteboard, marker in hand, and for a moment something flickered across her expression. Then she turned back to the diagram she'd been drawing. "Theory and practice both have their place in education, Cadet Jackson," she said quietly. "Sometimes understanding the why behind tactics is more important than simply knowing the how." Jackson exchanged a triumphant look with his friends. To him, her measured response was proof of weakness, confirmation that she couldn't handle real confrontation. What he didn't realize was that Diane's restraint came from a place of strength so profound that engaging with his juvenile provocations would have been like a tiger responding seriously to the yapping of a small dog. The psychological warfare escalated over the following days. Cadets would accidentally bump into her in hallways, forcing her to step aside. They'd speak over her during briefings, pretending they couldn't hear her voice. During outdoor exercises, they'd position themselves, so she had to walk around them to move between training stations. Each incident was individually minor, but collectively they created an atmosphere of constant disrespect. Cadet Rodriguez developed a particularly cruel habit of asking Professor Reeves to demonstrate physical techniques she was explaining, knowing she would politely decline. "Come on, ma'am," he'd say with mock encouragement. "Show us how a proper takedown is supposed to look." When she'd deflect by explaining the mechanics verbally instead, he'd shake his head sadly. "It's hard to learn from someone who's never actually done it." The other instructors began to notice the cadets' behavior, but their interventions were half-hearted. Sergeant Mitchell would occasionally bark, "Show some respect," when things got too obvious, but he didn't really disagree with the cadets' assessment. Colonel Patterson, when informed about the situation, had simply shrugged. "Maybe it will toughen her up. If she can't handle a few smart-mouthed kids, she doesn't belong here anyway." The isolation extended beyond the cadets to her fellow faculty members. During staff meetings, Professor Reeves's suggestions were politely acknowledged and then ignored. When she proposed modifications to training protocols based on what she observed, her colleagues would smile condescendingly and explain why academic theory didn't translate to real-world application. She was invited to social gatherings out of politeness, but treated like a peripheral figure who didn't quite belong. Dr. Amanda Foster, who taught military history, was particularly dismissive. "Diane means well," she'd say to other faculty members, "but she's never understood that there's a difference between reading about warfare and actually living it. The cadets can sense that disconnect." Foster had come to Thunderhawk Academy after a distinguished career as a military intelligence analyst, and she viewed Professor Reeves as an academic lightweight who'd somehow stumbled into a position she wasn't qualified for. The breaking point came during a combined arms exercise in late October. The scenario involved coordinating infantry movement with simulated air support and artillery, designed to teach cadets how different military branches work together during complex operations. Professor Reeves was assigned to observe and evaluate the cadets' performance, but from the moment the exercise began, it was clear that her presence was being treated as a joke. Professor Reeves will be monitoring radio communications, announced Sergeant Mitchell to the assembled cadets. She'll evaluate how effectively you coordinate between units. Several cadets openly rolled their eyes. Jackson whispered something to his squad that made them all laugh. The exercise was a disaster from the start. The cadets, overconfident and underprepared, made basic coordination errors that would have been fatal in real combat. They called in artillery strikes too close to their own positions, failed to establish proper communication protocols, and moved their units without regard for the tactical situation they'd been given. Professor Reeves watched it all unfold with the detached professionalism of someone who'd seen actual military operations go wrong in life-or-death situations. She took careful notes, documenting each mistake not with academic interest, but with the sharp analysis of someone who understood exactly why each error mattered and what the real-world consequences would be. When the exercise concluded, Sergeant Mitchell gathered the cadets for the after-action review. "Professor Reeves observed your performance today," he announced. "She'll provide feedback on your coordination and communication effectiveness." Diane stepped forward with her clipboard, but before she could speak, Jackson interrupted. "Sergeant, with respect, what can she possibly tell us that we don't already know?" His voice carried across the entire group. "We were out there actually doing the work while she was just watching and taking notes." Other cadets murmured agreement. Torres nodded vigorously. "It's like having someone who's never driven a car tell you how to parallel park." The metaphor drew laughter from the group. Even some of the younger instructors smiled at the comparison. Diane stood perfectly still, her clipboard held at her side, waiting for the mockery to subside. When silence finally returned, she spoke in the same measured tone she always used. "Your communication protocols failed at 0800 hours when 3rd Squad advanced, without confirming artillery timing with support element Alpha," she began methodically. "This resulted in a 3-minute window where friendly fire was not only possible, but probable given your movement vectors and the predetermined fire support coordinates." The cadets shuffled uncomfortably. Her assessment was technically accurate, but they resented being lectured by someone they considered an outsider. Jackson couldn't resist another challenge. "Those are just textbook scenarios, ma'am. In real combat, you adapt to the situation. You can't just follow the manual." "You're absolutely right, Cadet Jackson," Diane replied calmly. "Real combat requires adaptation, which is why your decision to move 2nd Squad through the valley approach without reconnaissance was particularly concerning. In an actual engagement, that terrain feature would be an obvious kill zone for enemy machine gun positions." "But there were no enemy positions there," Jackson protested. "No," Diane agreed. "There weren't, but if this had been real combat, you wouldn't have known that until you were taking casualties. The point of reconnaissance is to identify threats before they identify you." Her analysis continued for 10 more minutes, systematically breaking down every tactical error with the kind of detailed understanding that only comes from extensive experience. But instead of acknowledging her expertise, the cadets became increasingly resentful. They heard her corrections not as valuable instruction, but as criticism from someone who'd never faced the pressure they were training for. The tension finally exploded during weapons training the following week. Cadet Morrison had been struggling with his rifle qualifications, consistently scoring below the minimum standard required for advancement. Professor Reeves had been assigned to work with struggling marksmen, providing supplemental instruction to help them meet academy requirements. "I don't need help from someone who probably learned to shoot from YouTube videos," Morrison complained loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I need real instruction from someone who's actually used these weapons in combat." Cadet Williams, who'd been observing Professor Reeves more carefully than the others, tried to intervene. "Maybe we should just listen to what she has to say." "Listen to what?" Jackson cut him off. "More theoretical nonsense about breathing techniques and sight alignment. We need practical experience, not academic theory." Professor Reeves had been adjusting Morrison's stance when the argument erupted around her. She straightened slowly, her hands falling to her sides, as 23 young voices joined in criticizing her qualifications, her methods, her very presence at their academy. The complaints poured out like water through a broken dam, months of accumulated resentment finally finding voice. "She doesn't belong here," Torres declared. "This is a military academy, not a civilian college." "We need instructors who've actually served," Rodriguez added. "People who understand what we're preparing for." "Someone who's been there, done that," Morrison concluded, "not someone who's just read about it in books." The irony was so profound that Henry Kowalski, who was maintaining equipment nearby and overheard the entire exchange, had to suppress a bitter laugh. "If these kids only knew," he thought to himself. "If they had any idea who they were talking to." But Diane just stood there, absorbing their criticism, with the same patient silence she'd maintained for 8 months. Her expression never changed, her posture never shifted. To the cadets, her lack of response confirmed everything they believed about her weakness and incompetence. What they couldn't see was that their instructor was making mental calculations about each of their personalities, filing away information about how they handled stress, conflict, and group dynamics. She was learning about them the same way she'd once learned about enemy combatants, through careful observation of their behavior under pressure. The assessment would prove useful sooner than any of them expected. The crisis that would expose Professor Reeves's true capabilities began on a gray Tuesday morning in November, when Thunderhawk Academy received an unexpected visit from General Patricia Hawthorne, the commanding officer of the entire Western Military District. Her inspection wasn't scheduled. Those were always announced weeks in advance to allow for preparation. This was what military personnel called a no-notice evaluation, designed to see how the academy functioned under normal operating conditions. Colonel Patterson was visibly sweating as he escorted the general through the facilities, desperately trying to present everything in the best possible light, while having no time to hide the academy's usual problems. The cadets, caught off guard by the presence of such high-ranking authority, were nervous and making mistakes they wouldn't normally make. "I want to observe your advanced tactical training," General Hawthorne announced during the brief tour, "something that demonstrates how well your cadets can handle complex operational scenarios under pressure." Patterson's mind raced. Most of their advanced scenarios required weeks of preparation, detailed planning, and careful coordination. But he couldn't admit that to a general who'd traveled 300 miles to evaluate their program. "Of course, ma'am, we have an excellent urban warfare simulation that we can execute immediately." What Patterson didn't mention was that the urban warfare simulation was Thunderhawk Academy's most challenging exercise. A complex scenario involving multiple objectives, time constraints, and the kind of decision-making pressure that separated competent soldiers from exceptional ones. It was usually reserved for final-year cadets who'd had months to prepare, not first-year students who'd never attempted anything remotely similar. The exercise took place in Combat Town, a mock urban environment built on the Academy's northern training grounds, complete with building facades, street layouts, and hidden positions for opposing forces. It was designed to simulate the chaos and confusion of real urban combat. The scenario involved rescuing hostages, neutralizing enemy positions, and coordinating with air support, all while under time pressure and constant threat of simulated enemy fire. General Hawthorne positioned herself in the observation tower with Colonel Patterson and the senior staff, including Professor Reeves, who'd been assigned to monitor communications and evaluate cadet performance. Through reinforced windows, they had a clear view of the entire training area spread out below them. "Brief me on the scenario," the general commanded. Patterson cleared his throat nervously. 23 cadets divided into 4 squads. Mission: rescue civilian hostages held in Building Charlie while neutralizing enemy positions in Buildings Alpha and Bravo. Time limit: 45 minutes. They have radio communication, simulated air support, and standard infantry weapons loaded with training rounds. Opposition forces: 12 Academy instructors playing enemy combatants positioned throughout the urban environment. They're equipped with observer controller equipment to register hits and evaluate cadet performance. General Hawthorne nodded and turned her attention to the training area below. The cadets were gathered at the entry point, receiving their final briefing from Sergeant Mitchell. Even from the observation tower, their nervousness was visible. "Who's leading this exercise?" the general asked. "Cadet Jackson has been designated squad leader," Patterson replied. "He's shown natural leadership qualities and tactical understanding." Professor Reeves made a note on her evaluation sheet, but said nothing. She'd observed Jackson's leadership for months and had serious concerns about his decision-making under pressure, but this wasn't the time or place to voice them. The exercise began poorly and deteriorated rapidly. Jackson, overconfident and eager to impress the visiting general, immediately made the kind of aggressive, tactical errors that Professor Reeves had been trying to teach them to avoid. He split his forces too early, committed too many resources to the initial assault, and failed to establish proper communication protocols between his squads. "First squad, advance on Building Alpha," Jackson's voice crackled over the radio. "Second and third squads, flanking maneuver on Building Bravo. Fourth squad, establish overwatch position." Professor Reeves winced. Jackson was dividing his small force across too many objectives simultaneously, violating basic principles of concentration and mutual support. Worse, he was using radio communications without proper encryption protocols, broadcasting his intentions to enemy forces who were undoubtedly listening. Within 10 minutes, the exercise was a catastrophe. First squad walked into a crossfire between Buildings Alpha and Charlie, taking heavy simulated casualties. Second squad became pinned down in an alley with no cover and no escape route. Third squad lost communication entirely when their radio operator was killed in the opening moments of their assault. From the observation tower, General Hawthorne watched with growing disapproval as the carefully planned scenario devolved into chaos. Cadets were making fundamental errors that would have been fatal in real combat, advancing without reconnaissance, failing to maintain unit cohesion, and responding to enemy contact with panic rather than disciplined tactical procedures. "This is unacceptable," she said quietly to Colonel Patterson. "These cadets aren't ready for basic infantry operations, much less the advanced scenarios you claimed they could handle." Patterson's face flushed red. "General, they're still learning. First-year cadets naturally make mistakes during complex exercises. First-year cadets shouldn't be attempting exercises of this complexity if they haven't mastered fundamental skills," the general replied sharply. "This isn't training, it's disaster preparation." Professor Reeves continued taking notes. documenting each tactical error with the detailed precision of someone who understood exactly why each mistake mattered. She watched Jackson's leadership collapse under pressure, saw Rodriguez panic when his squad came under fire, observed Morrison freeze completely when faced with a decision between multiple bad options. The situation reached critical failure when Jackson, desperate to salvage the exercise, ordered a direct frontal assault on Building Charlie, where the hostages were being held. It was exactly the kind of aggressive, poorly planned operation that Professor Reeves had warned against in her tactical theory classes. "All squads converge on Building Charlie," Jackson commanded over the radio. "We're going in hard and fast." "Negative," came Sergeant Mitchell's voice from his position as exercise controller. "Second squad is combat ineffective. Third squad is out of communication. You have 6 operational cadets attempting to assault a fortified position." But Jackson was beyond listening to reason. The presence of General Hawthorne had turned the exercise into a high-stakes performance, and he was determined to succeed, regardless of the tactical realities. "Fourth squad, provide covering fire. First squad, breach and clear." What followed was a textbook example of how not to conduct urban assault operations. The remaining cadets advanced without coordination, bunched together in fatal formations, and failed to use available cover effectively. Within minutes, the exercise controllers had marked them all as casualties. General Hawthorne turned away from the window in disgust. "Terminate the exercise," she ordered. "This is an embarrassment to military training." Colonel Patterson reached for his radio, but before he could speak, Professor Reeves stepped forward. "General, if I may suggest an alternative approach." Both officers looked at her with surprise. Throughout the disaster unfolding below, she'd remained silent, taking notes and observing. Now she was speaking with quiet confidence that seemed completely at odds with her usual demeanor. "These cadets have made significant tactical errors," she continued, "but the scenario itself is recoverable. The fundamental problems are leadership, coordination, and tactical decision-making, all correctable with proper guidance." General Hawthorne studied her with interest. "You're suggesting we continue this debacle?" "I'm suggesting we demonstrate how the scenario should be executed," Professor Reeves replied calmly. "Let me take operational control and show these cadets what they're missing." The request was so unexpected that both senior officers were momentarily speechless. Colonel Patterson recovered first, his voice uncertain. "Professor Reeves, this is a complex tactical scenario requiring extensive field experience. It's not really appropriate for someone with my background," she finished quietly. "General, these cadets need to see the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. They need to understand what right looks like before they can identify what they're doing wrong." General Hawthorne was intrigued despite herself. There was something in Professor Reeves's tone, a quiet authority that hadn't been there during her usual classroom instruction. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Reset the exercise. Same scenario, same objectives, same time constraints. But let me coordinate the tactical operations while the cadets execute. Show them how proper leadership and decision-making can turn a failed mission into a successful one." Patterson started to object again, but General Hawthorne held up a hand. "Professor Reeves, you understand this is a high-pressure tactical scenario requiring split-second decisions and combat-level coordination?" "Yes, ma'am, I do." "And you're confident you can demonstrate the level of tactical expertise necessary to guide these cadets through a successful mission?" Professor Reeves met the general's gaze directly, and for the first time in 8 months, she allowed a hint of her true self to show through. "General, I'm confident that with proper leadership, this scenario is not only achievable, but straightforward." The transformation in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. The hesitant academic tone was gone, replaced by something that sounded remarkably like command authority. General Hawthorne, who'd spent 30 years in the military and knew confidence when she heard it, made a decision that would change everything. "Very well, Professor. Reset the exercise. You have tactical command. Show me what these cadets are capable of under proper leadership." As Patterson reluctantly gave orders to reset the scenario, none of them realized they were about to witness something extraordinary. The cadets, who'd spent months mocking their instructor's competence, were about to discover what real tactical expertise looked like when deployed by someone who'd learned it in places where mistakes meant more than just embarrassment. The stage was set for a demonstration that would shatter every assumption they'd made about the quiet woman they'd dismissed as academically irrelevant. The reset took 15 minutes. Cadets who had been killed in the previous attempt returned to the starting position, their confidence shattered and morale at rock bottom. They'd just failed spectacularly in front of the highest-ranking officer most of them had ever seen, and now they were being told to repeat the humiliation under the guidance of the instructor they respected least. "This is insane," Jackson muttered to Rodriguez as they checked their equipment. "Now they want the college professor to tell us how to do our jobs? This day just keeps getting worse." "Maybe she'll finally realize she's out of her depth," Torres replied bitterly. "Nothing like public failure to show someone where they really belong." The cadets' resentment was palpable as they formed up at the starting line. They'd endured months of what they perceived as inadequate instruction from Professor Reeves, and now their failure was somehow being blamed on their inability to follow her guidance. From their perspective, they were being set up to fail again, this time with their least qualified instructor calling the shots. Sergeant Mitchell approached them with barely concealed frustration. "Listen up. Professor Reeves has tactical command for this iteration. You will follow her instructions precisely and immediately. No questions, no hesitation, no independent decisions. Is that understood?" "Yes, Sergeant," came the chorus of responses, but the lack of enthusiasm was obvious. In the observation tower, General Hawthorne positioned herself to monitor radio communications, while Colonel Patterson coordinated with the exercise controllers. Professor Reeves stood at the communication console, adjusting headset settings with movements that seemed unusually practiced for someone whose experience was supposedly limited to academic theory. "Thunderhawk Control, this is command," she spoke into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly over the communication system. "Request status report on all opposing forces and exercise parameters." Even her radio protocol was different now. Crisp, professional, using proper military communication procedures that surprised everyone listening. Gone was the hesitant tone they'd grown accustomed to during her classroom instruction. "Command, this is control," came the response from the exercise coordinator. 12 opposing forces positioned in buildings Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. Civilian hostages located in Charlie, Room 3. Weather clear, wind negligible, visibility unlimited, exercise area secured and ready for operations. Copy control. Thunderhawk Command has tactical control. Beginning operations now. Professor Reeves switched to the cadet tactical frequency, and when she spoke again, her voice carried an authority that none of them had ever heard before. "All Thunder elements, this is command. Prepare for mission briefing and tactical assignments." The cadets exchanged confused glances. The woman speaking over their radios sounded like Professor Reeves, but the tone, the confidence, the professional command presence was completely different. It was as if someone else entirely had taken control of their communication system. "Thunder 1-1, you are first squad leader," she continued, addressing Jackson directly. "Your squad will establish overwatch position on the water tower. Grid reference 245-189. You have responsibility for early warning and fire support coordination. Acknowledge. Jackson hesitated, thrown off by the specificity and authority of the instruction. Command, this is Thunder 1-1. Acknowledge overwatch position, water tower. Thunder 1-2, she continued, addressing Rodriguez. Your squad will conduct reconnaissance of the target area from the eastern approach. I need real-time intelligence on enemy positions, movement patterns, and structural layout. No engagement until authorized. Acknowledge. Rodriguez, equally confused by the professional competence he was hearing, responded more crisply. Command, Thunder 1-2, acknowledges reconnaissance mission. Eastern approach. The briefing continued with systematic precision that impressed even General Hawthorne, who was monitoring from the observation tower. Professor Reeves assigned specific roles to each squad: reconnaissance, overwatch, assault, and support, with tactical reasoning that demonstrated deep understanding of small unit operations. But what truly shocked the listening officers was the level of detail in her instructions. She provided specific grid coordinates for movement routes, designated primary and alternate communication frequencies, established contingency plans for various scenarios, and coordinated timing with such precision that it was clear she'd run similar operations many times before. All Thunder elements, she concluded, this is a deliberate operation, not a hasty assault. Speed is important, but accuracy and coordination are critical. Enemy forces are experienced and well-positioned. Your survival depends on following the tactical plan exactly as briefed. Command will provide continuous guidance, but you must trust the process. Begin movement now. The difference in cadet performance was immediate and dramatic, with clear, specific instructions replacing Jackson's panicked improvisation. The squads moved with purpose and coordination they'd never demonstrated before. First Squad established their overwatch position with textbook precision, using proper communication protocols to report their status and readiness. Second Squad's reconnaissance was methodical and professional, with Rodriguez providing detailed intelligence reports that allowed Professor Reeves to build an accurate picture of enemy positions and defensive preparations. His squad moved like actual soldiers rather than confused trainees, because they finally had leadership that knew what information was needed and how to use it effectively. Command, this is Thunder 1-2. Rodriguez reported over the radio. Enemy positions identified in Building Alpha. Second floor windows facing south and west. Estimated 4 personnel with automatic weapons. Building Bravo appears lightly defended. Possible 2 personnel in ground floor positions. Building Charlie shows movement in multiple rooms. Unable to confirm exact numbers. Excellent work, Thunder 1-2, came Professor Reeves's response. Continue observation and report any changes in enemy posture. Thunder 1-3, you are cleared to begin approach phase using route Delta as briefed. Morrison, leading Third Squad, acknowledged and began moving his team through the predetermined approach route with careful attention to cover and concealment. For the first time in the exercise, cadets were using proper tactical movement, staying low, maintaining interval, and advancing by mutual support rather than bunching together in vulnerable formations. General Hawthorne leaned forward in the observation tower, watching the dramatic transformation taking place below. The same cadets who had been stumbling through basic maneuvers 20 minutes earlier were now executing complex tactical operations with competence that bordered on professional level. The only variable that had changed was their leadership and coordination. Colonel Patterson, she said quietly, where exactly did Professor Reeves learn to coordinate tactical operations at this level? Patterson was staring at the tactical display with obvious confusion. honestly don't know, General. Her personnel file shows academic background, some civilian teaching experience. Nothing that would explain this level of tactical expertise. The assault phase began with precision that would have impressed seasoned military observers. Professor Reeves coordinated the attack using proven small unit tactics. Suppressive fire from overwatch positions, diversionary movement to draw enemy attention, and a carefully timed breach that exploited weaknesses identified during the reconnaissance phase. Thunder 1-1. Initiate suppressive fire on building. Alpha, second floor windows. Thunder 1-4. Smoke deployment on my mark. Thunder 1-3. Prepare for breach of building Charlie on my command. The coordination was flawless. Covering fire pinned down enemy forces in building Alpha, while smoke grenades provided concealment for the assault team's final approach. Morrison's squad breached building Charlie using proper room-clearing techniques, systematically advancing through the structure while maintaining communication and mutual support. Command, this is Thunder 1-3. Building Charlie secured, hostages recovered, no casualties, enemy forces neutralized. The entire operation had taken 18 minutes, well within the time limit, and executed with tactical proficiency that exceeded anything Thunderhawk Academy cadets had ever demonstrated. Even the exercise controllers playing enemy forces were impressed by the systematic way their positions had been identified, isolated, and neutralized. But as the successful conclusion of the exercise became apparent, the cadets' initial elation was replaced by growing confusion and unease. They'd just executed a complex tactical operation under the guidance of the instructor they'd been mocking for months. The professor they'd dismissed as incompetent had just demonstrated command capabilities that surpassed anything they'd seen from their regular military instructors. Jackson stood near the water tower, staring at his radio in bewilderment. The tactical guidance he'd received had been more precise and effective than anything he'd experienced during his time at the academy. Every instruction had been exactly right. Every piece of timing perfect. Every tactical decision optimized for success. Rodriguez was equally shaken. The intelligence requirements he'd been given were specific and professional, indicating someone who understood exactly what information was needed for tactical decision-making. This wasn't theoretical knowledge gleaned from textbooks. This was practical expertise gained through extensive operational experience. Morrison, who'd led the actual assault, was perhaps most affected of all. The breach and clearing procedures he'd been guided through were advanced techniques he'd only read about in special operations manuals. No civilian instructor should have known those methods, much less been able to coordinate their execution in real time. As the cadets gathered at the conclusion point, their previous arrogance and contempt had been replaced by confusion and growing suspicion. They'd just experienced something that challenged every assumption they'd made about their instructor, but they couldn't yet process what it meant. Professor Reeves's voice came over the radio one final time. All Thunder elements, excellent work. Return to start point for debrief. Command, out. The tone was professional and satisfied, but underneath it was something else. A hint of the satisfaction that comes from proving a point that had been a long time in the making. The cadets had just learned what competent leadership looked like, even if they didn't yet understand who had provided it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. In the observation tower, General Hawthorne was studying Professor Reeves with new interest. The woman standing at the communication console bore little resemblance to the hesitant academic who had been introduced to her an hour earlier. This was someone who understood tactical operations at a level that suggested extensive military experience. "Professor Reeves," she said as the exercise concluded, "that was an impressive demonstration of tactical coordination." "Thank you, General," came the quiet reply. The cadets performed well once they had clear guidance and proper leadership structure. But General Hawthorne wasn't satisfied with that modest deflection. She'd spent 30 years in the military, and she knew operational competence when she saw it. What she'd just witnessed wasn't academic theory applied to practical scenarios. It was professional-level tactical coordination executed by someone with extensive field experience. The question was who exactly Professor Diane Reeves really was, and why someone with her obvious capabilities was teaching basic courses to first-year cadets instead of leading advanced operations for elite military units. That question was about to be answered in a way that would shock everyone present. The debriefing session that followed was unlike anything the cadets had ever experienced at Thunderhawk Academy. They gathered in the main briefing room, still processing what had just happened during the exercise, while General Hawthorne, Colonel Patterson, and the senior staff took seats at the front of the room. Professor Reeves sat quietly to the side, her demeanor having returned to the familiar, unassuming presence they'd grown accustomed to over the past 8 months. But something had fundamentally shifted. The cadets kept glancing at her with expressions that mixed confusion, suspicion, and grudging respect. They'd just experienced tactical coordination unlike anything in their previous training, and the source of that expertise was the woman they'd been dismissing as incompetent for months. General Hawthorne stood to address the group, her expression thoughtful as she studied the assembled cadets. "That was quite a remarkable transformation," she began. "The same personnel, the same equipment, the same scenario, but dramatically different results. Can anyone explain what changed between the first iteration and the second?" Jackson raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, we had better coordination in the second attempt. The instructions were more specific." "Specific how, Cadet Jackson?" "The tactical guidance was more precise, General. Grid coordinates instead of general directions. Specific timing instead of when ready. Clear assignments for each squad instead of just general objectives." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "The intelligence requirements were professional level, ma'am. We knew exactly what information command needed and how to provide it. Made everything more efficient." General Hawthorne turned toward Professor Reeves. "And where did this improved tactical coordination come from, Professor?" Before Diane could respond, Colonel Patterson interjected nervously. "General, Professor Reeves has been studying our tactical manuals extensively. She's clearly learned a great deal from observing our training exercises." But General Hawthorne's expression suggested she wasn't buying that explanation. She'd seen too many tactical operations to believe that academic study alone could produce the level of coordination they'd just witnessed. "Professor Reeves, you demonstrated remarkable familiarity with small unit tactics, communication protocols, and operational procedures. That kind of expertise typically requires extensive hands-on experience." The room fell silent. 23 cadets and a dozen staff members waited for her response, all of them sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. Professor Reeves sat quietly for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, appearing to consider her words carefully. "I've had some practical experience with tactical operations," she said finally, her voice maintaining its characteristic quiet tone. "What kind of practical experience?" General Hawthorne pressed gently but firmly. Another pause. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for clarification that might explain the dramatic competence they'd just witnessed. When Professor Reeves spoke again, her words were measured and careful. "I served in the military before coming to Thunderhawk Academy. My experience included some tactical training and operational assignments. Cadet Williams, who had been the most observant of Professor Reeves's unusual behaviors over the past months, leaned forward with interest. "What branch of service, ma'am?" "Army," she replied simply. Jackson couldn't contain his skepticism. "With respect, ma'am, basic Army training doesn't explain what we just saw. That was advanced-level tactical coordination, special operations type stuff." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Professor Reeves looked directly at Jackson, and for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not anger or defensiveness, but the kind of calm assessment that precedes a difficult decision. General Hawthorne recognized that look. She'd seen it in the eyes of soldiers who were deciding how much truth to reveal about classified experiences. "Professor Reeves, your tactical coordination was exceptionally sophisticated. I'm curious about the nature of your military service." "I prefer not to discuss the details, General. My military experience is in the past. I'm here to teach these cadets, and I believe we should focus on their development rather than my background." But General Hawthorne wasn't ready to let the subject drop. Something about Professor Reeves's demonstration had triggered her professional curiosity. The level of tactical expertise she'd witnessed suggested military experience far beyond standard service, and she was beginning to suspect that Thunderhawk Academy's quiet instructor might be more than she appeared. "Professor, I'm not asking out of idle curiosity. Your demonstration today suggests advanced tactical training that could be valuable for our curriculum development. If you have specialized experience that could benefit our cadets, I'd like to understand how we might better utilize your expertise." The question was reasonable and professionally motivated, but it placed Professor Reeves in an impossible position. She could continue deflecting, which would only increase suspicion, or she could begin revealing information that she'd spent 8 months carefully concealing. She chose a middle path. "General, I served in various capacities during my time in the Army. Some of those assignments involved tactical operations and leadership responsibilities. I learned valuable skills that I try to share with these cadets through my instruction." Cadet Morrison, emboldened by the ongoing discussion, raised his hand. "Professor Reeves, ma'am, why didn't you ever mention your military service? We thought you didn't have practical experience." The question exposed the heart of the issue. For months, the cadets had been treating her with disrespect, based on their assumption that she lacked military credentials. Now they were learning that their assumption might have been completely wrong. Professor Reeves met Morrison's gaze directly. "Would it have mattered, Cadet Morrison? Would you have treated me differently if you'd known about my service?" The question was pointed and uncomfortable. Morrison shifted in his seat, suddenly aware that his treatment of Professor Reeves might have been based on prejudice rather than fact. Jackson, still defensive about his earlier behavior, tried to justify their attitudes. "Ma'am, it's just that you never acted like a veteran. You didn't talk like military, didn't carry yourself like someone with combat experience." "And how exactly does someone with combat experience supposed to act, Cadet Jackson?" The challenge in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. Jackson found himself unable to answer, realizing that his expectations were based on stereotypes rather than actual understanding. General Hawthorne observed this exchange with growing interest. Professor Reeves was deflecting specific questions about her service, while simultaneously challenging the cadets' assumptions and prejudices. It was the kind of subtle psychological maneuvering that suggested someone accustomed to managing information and controlling perceptions. "Professor Reeves," the general said carefully, "I'm beginning to suspect that your military service might have been more extensive than you're indicating. The tactical coordination I witnessed today suggests advanced training and significant operational experience. For the first time during the conversation, Professor Reeves hesitated before responding. The moment stretched long enough for everyone in the room to recognize that they were approaching something significant. "General, some military experiences are better left in the past," she said finally. "I came to Thunderhawk Academy to contribute to these cadets' education, not to relive my previous career." It was a deflection, but it confirmed that there was indeed something more to her background than she'd been revealing. General Hawthorne filed that information away, making a mental note to conduct some research into Professor Reeves's actual service record. The awkward silence was broken by the arrival of a breathless Academy staff member who burst through the briefing room doors with obvious urgency. "Colonel Patterson, sir, we have an emergency situation. You're needed in the command center immediately." Patterson stood up with confusion. "What kind of emergency?" "Sir, we've received an urgent communication from Pentagon Operations. There's been an incident and they're requesting immediate assistance from Academy personnel." The room buzzed with sudden tension. Emergency communications from the Pentagon were rare and typically involved serious national security issues. Whatever was happening was significant enough to interrupt a general officer's inspection visit. "What kind of incident?" General Hawthorne demanded, her voice sharp with authority. The staff member looked uncertain, glancing around the room at the assembled cadets and faculty. "Ma'am, the details are classified, but they specifically requested Academy instructors with advanced tactical experience and security clearances." Patterson frowned. "Most of our instructors have basic clearances, but advanced tactical experience is limited. We'd need to identify personnel with specialized backgrounds." "Sir," the staff member continued, "they specifically asked for Professor Diane Reeves by name." The words fell into the briefing room like a physical blow. Every head turned toward Professor Reeves, who had gone completely still in her chair. Her face showed no expression, but those watching closely could see her hands tighten slightly in her lap. "By name," General Hawthorne repeated slowly. "The Pentagon specifically requested Professor Reeves?" "Yes, ma'am. They said it was urgent and that she should report for immediate consultation on a tactical situation requiring her specific expertise." The implications hung heavy in the air. The Pentagon didn't request civilian instructors by name unless they possessed specialized knowledge or experience that couldn't be found elsewhere. For Professor Reeves to be specifically identified suggested that her military background was far more significant than she'd been admitting. Jackson stared at her with growing realization. "They know who you are," he said quietly. "The Pentagon knows exactly who you are." Professor Reeves stood slowly, her composure maintained, but her expression suddenly distant. "I need to take this communication," she said simply. But as she moved toward the door, General Hawthorne's voice stopped her. "Professor Reeves, I think it's time we had a complete discussion about your background. The Pentagon doesn't request specific personnel for tactical consultations unless they have very particular qualifications." Professor Reeves paused at the door, her back to the room. When she turned around, something fundamental had changed in her bearing. The mild-mannered academic facade was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of someone entirely different underneath. "General," she said quietly, "some stories are classified for good reasons, but it appears that my past is about to catch up with my present whether I want it to or not." The cadets sat in stunned silence as the implications of her words sank in. The instructor they'd been mocking for 8 months wasn't just a veteran. She was someone significant enough for the Pentagon to know her name and request her specific expertise during an emergency. Everything they thought they knew about Professor Diane Reeves was about to be turned upside down. The secure communication room at Thunderhawk Academy hadn't been used for classified Pentagon communications in over 2 years. Located in the basement of the administration building, it was equipped with encrypted communication systems, signal scramblers, and the kind of security protocols typically reserved for high-level military operations. As Professor Reeves followed Colonel Patterson down the reinforced corridor, her footsteps echoed with a different rhythm than usual, more purposeful, more military in bearing. General Hawthorne had insisted on accompanying them, her curiosity about Professor Reeves's true identity now overriding normal protocol considerations. The three officers walked in tense silence, each processing the implications of the Pentagon's unexpected request for a civilian instructor by name. The communication technician on duty, Sergeant Davis, looked up with surprise as they entered. "Colonel, we don't usually have personnel down here for classified communications." "Patch us through to Pentagon operations," Patterson ordered. "Priority Alpha clearance, Professor Reeves receiving." "Sir, Professor Reeves would need appropriate security clearance for—" "Just make the connection, Sergeant," General Hawthorne interrupted, with authority that brooked no argument. As the secure line connected, static filled the room before clearing to reveal a crisp military voice. "Pentagon Operations, this is Colonel Marcus Webb, Joint Special Operations Command. I need to speak with Colonel Diane Reeves immediately." The title hit the room like a physical force. Colonel Diane Reeves, not Professor, Colonel. The woman they'd known as a quiet civilian instructor was being addressed by Pentagon Operations as a full colonel in the United States Army. Professor Reeves, Colonel Reeves, stepped forward to the communication console, her entire bearing transforming as she spoke. "Colonel Webb, this is Colonel Reeves. I'm receiving on a non-secure line with observers present. What's the situation?" "Diana, thank God. We have a crisis developing in the Pacific Theater. Hostage situation involving American military personnel, and the tactical parameters match operations you've handled before. We need your assessment and possible direct involvement." General Hawthorne stared at the woman beside her with complete bewilderment. The quiet, unassuming instructor she'd been observing all day was speaking with Pentagon Operations using first-name familiarity and discussing classified military operations as if they were routine matters. "Specifics, Marcus," Colonel Reeves replied, her voice now carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to high-level military command. 12 American service members captured during a reconnaissance mission near hostile territory. The capture site is fortified, heavily defended, and situated in terrain that eliminates conventional rescue approaches. Intelligence suggests the hostages are being held in an underground facility accessible only through a series of narrow passages and defended positions. Colonel Patterson and General Hawthorne exchanged stunned glances. This was a discussion of active military operations involving American lives, and their civilian instructor was being briefed on classified details by Joint Special Operations Command. "Timeline for execution?" Colonel Reeves asked. 48 hours maximum. After that, intelligence suggests the hostages will be moved to a location beyond our reach. "Diana, this situation requires someone with your specific expertise in confined space rescue operations and underground tactical environments." The pieces were beginning to fall into place for General Hawthorne. Colonel Reeves wasn't just a veteran with some tactical experience. She was apparently a specialist in complex rescue operations, someone whose expertise was considered irreplaceable by the highest levels of military command. "Current assets available for the operation?" Colonel Reeves continued. "SEAL Team 6 is standing by, but they lack experience with the specific tactical challenges we're facing. The terrain and facility layout match operations you successfully executed in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. The Joint Chiefs specifically requested your involvement." General Hawthorne felt the ground shifting beneath her understanding of reality. The woman standing beside her was being personally requested by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for an active rescue operation. This wasn't just military experience, this was elite-level expertise that existed at the very highest echelons of special operations. Colonel Reeves was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of responsibility that none of the Academy personnel had ever heard from her before. "Marcus, I'm currently assigned to training duties. My operational status is inactive." "Diana, we both know that's a technicality. Your skills haven't degraded, and this situation specifically requires your expertise. The Secretary of Defense has authorized immediate reactivation if you're willing to accept the mission." The room fell into complete silence except for the hum of the communication equipment. Everyone present realized they were witnessing a moment of enormous significance, the potential reactivation of a military specialist whose expertise was apparently so rare that the highest levels of government were personally requesting her involvement. "Who else knows about this communication?" Colonel Reeves asked. "Classification level is restricted to Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, and immediate operational personnel. Your current assignment personnel are being briefed on a need-to-know basis." General Hawthorne stepped forward, her voice carefully controlled. "Colonel Webb, this is General Patricia Hawthorne, Western Military District. I'm currently conducting an inspection at the Academy where Colonel Reeves is assigned. Can you provide some context for her background and why her expertise is considered essential?" General Hawthorne, Colonel Diane Reeves, is one of the most experienced special operations officers in the United States military. Over 12 years of active service with Army Special Forces, including 3 years as team leader for the most classified rescue operations conducted by American forces in the past decade. The revelation struck the listening officers like lightning. Army Special Forces, team leader for classified rescue operations, 12 years of special operations experience. The quiet instructor they'd been observing was apparently one of the most elite military specialists in the entire armed forces. Her operational record includes successful execution of 17 high-risk rescue missions in hostile territory, with 0 American casualties during operations under her command. She specialized in confined space operations, underground facility infiltration, and hostage rescue in tactically challenging environments. General Hawthorne looked at Colonel Reeves with new understanding. The tactical coordination she'd witnessed during the Academy exercise suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't academic knowledge applied to training scenarios. This was world-class expertise being applied to basic cadet instruction. Colonel Reeves was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for actions during Operation Serpent's Den, where she led a rescue mission that saved 14 captured American personnel from an underground facility in hostile territory. The operation parameters were nearly identical to our current situation. The Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, awarded only for extraordinary heroism in combat. General Hawthorne realized she was standing next to one of the most decorated special operations officers in the military, someone whose achievements were apparently so classified that even her presence at the Academy was a closely guarded secret. "Why is Colonel Reeves currently assigned to training duties?" General Hawthorne asked. "That information is classified, General. I can tell you that her assignment to the Academy serves multiple strategic purposes, including the development of specialized training protocols for future special operations personnel." Colonel Reeves finally spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of someone making a decision that would affect multiple lives. "Marcus, what's the tactical assessment of success probability with current assets?" Without your involvement, our analysts estimate 60% probability of mission success with acceptable casualties. With your leadership, that estimate rises to 95% with minimal risk to American personnel. The mathematics of life and death hung in the air. 12 American service members whose lives might depend on the decision of the woman who'd been quietly teaching basic tactics to Academy cadets for 8 months. Time frame for deployment if I accept reactivation? Transport is standing by. You could be on site for operational planning within 6 hours. Colonel Reeves closed her eyes briefly, and everyone in the room could see the internal struggle taking place. She'd clearly left operational service for personal reasons, but the lives of American service members were hanging in the balance. When she opened her eyes, her expression had hardened with resolve. Marcus, I'll take the mission, initiate reactivation protocols, and have operational planning materials ready for my arrival. Confirmed, Diana. Transport will arrive at your location within 30 minutes. And Diana, thank you. These people need you. I'll see you soon, Marcus. Colonel Reeves, out. The communication ended, leaving the room in stunned silence. The transformation was complete. Professor Diane Reeves, the quiet academic instructor who'd been mocked and dismissed by cadets for months, had just accepted reactivation as Colonel Diana Reeves, one of the most elite special operations officers in the United States military. General Hawthorne was the first to speak. Colonel Reeves, I owe you an apology. We clearly had no idea who you really were. Colonel Reeves turned to face her, and the change in her bearing was remarkable. Gone was the tentative, accommodating demeanor of the instructor. In its place stood someone who radiated the quiet confidence of a warrior who'd led life-or-death missions in the most dangerous places on Earth. General, my assignment here was classified for operational security reasons. The cadets weren't supposed to know my background because they needed to learn from the training itself, not from deference to rank or reputation. Colonel Patterson, still processing the revelation, managed to find his voice. The tactical coordination during today's exercise, that was just a fraction of what you're capable of. Today's exercise was basic small unit tactics, Colonel. The missions I've led involve significantly more complex operational parameters. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching aircraft filled the air above the academy. Through the small basement window, they could see the outline of military helicopters beginning their descent toward the academy landing pad. Colonel Reeves straightened her uniform and checked her watch, with the automatic movements of someone preparing for deployment. I need to brief the cadets before I leave. They deserve to understand what they've witnessed today. But as they prepared to return upstairs, General Hawthorne realized that the cadets were about to receive the shock of their lives. The instructor they'd spent months disrespecting and dismissing was about to be revealed as one of the most accomplished military heroes any of them would ever meet. The truth about Colonel Diana Reeves was finally going to come to light. The briefing room had transformed into a scene of barely controlled chaos when Colonel Reeves, General Hawthorne, and Colonel Patterson returned from the communication center. Word had spread throughout Thunderhawk Academy that their civilian instructor had just received an emergency Pentagon communication, and now military helicopters were landing on the academy grounds, with rotors spinning and personnel moving with urgent purpose. 23 cadets sat in stunned silence as the implications of what they'd overheard began to sink in. Through the windows, they could see soldiers in full combat gear establishing a security perimeter around the landing zone. This wasn't a training exercise or a routine visit. This was a real military operation unfolding before their eyes. Colonel Reeves entered the room with a bearing that none of the cadets had ever seen before. Gone was every trace of the hesitant, accommodating instructor they'd known for 8 months. In her place stood someone who moved with the fluid confidence of a combat veteran, her eyes scanning the room with the systematic awareness of someone trained to assess threats and control tactical situations. "Cadets," she began, her voice carrying a command authority that made everyone unconsciously straighten in their chairs. "Circumstances require me to provide you with information about my background that has previously been classified." Jackson, still struggling to process the day's revelations, raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, are you actually in the military?" Colonel Reeves looked directly at him with an expression that combined patience with the kind of steady authority that comes from leading life-or-death missions. "Cadet Jackson, I am Colonel Diane Reeves, United States Army Special Forces. I have been on temporary assignment to this academy as part of a classified training development program." The words hit the assembled cadets like a physical force. Colonel, Army Special Forces, classified assignment. Every assumption they'd made about their instructor crumbled in an instant. Rodriguez found his voice first. "Ma'am, Special Forces like actual Green Berets?" "Yes, Cadet Rodriguez. I served for 12 years with Army Special Forces, including 3 years as team leader for classified operations in multiple theaters of operation." Morrison leaned forward with disbelief written across his face. "But ma'am, you never said anything. You let us think. We treated you like someone without military experience," Colonel Reeves finished calmly. "Yes, Cadet Morrison, you did. That was intentional. My assignment here was to observe and evaluate cadet training methods while maintaining operational security about my background." The silence in the room was deafening as the cadets grappled with the magnitude of their misjudgment. For months, they'd been disrespecting and dismissing someone whose military credentials far exceeded anything they could hope to achieve. Williams, who had been the most observant of the group, spoke up quietly. "The signs were there, weren't they? The way you moved, the things you knew, the way you handled emergencies." Colonel Reeves nodded. "Very observant, Cadet Williams. Special operations personnel are trained to blend into civilian environments, but certain behaviors and skills are difficult to completely suppress." Torres, looking increasingly uncomfortable, asked, "Ma'am, what kind of operations did you lead?" "Classified operations, Cadet Torres. Primarily hostage rescue and direct action missions in hostile territory. The details remain classified, but I can tell you that my specialty was confined space operations and underground facility infiltration." General Hawthorne stepped forward to address the cadets. "What Colonel Reeves is not telling you is that she is one of the most decorated special operations officers in the United States military. Her operational record includes successful rescue missions that saved dozens of American lives in some of the most dangerous places on Earth." The revelation was overwhelming. Jackson sat back in his chair, his face pale as he realized the full scope of how wrong he'd been. "Colonel, I treated you terribly. I questioned your competence, your qualifications, your right to be here." Colonel Reeves studied him for a moment before responding. "Cadet Jackson, you treated me exactly as you were supposed to. Your behavior provided valuable intelligence about how cadets respond to authority figures they perceive as weak or unqualified. That information will be used to improve training protocols for future classes." The idea that their disrespectful behavior had been observed and analyzed as part of a classified evaluation was almost as shocking as learning about her military background. They'd been unknowingly participating in an assessment of their own character and leadership potential. "But why?" Stevens asked. "Why not just tell us who you were from the beginning?" "Because real leadership isn't about rank or reputation, Cadet Stevens. It's about competence, decision-making under pressure, and the ability to earn respect through actions rather than titles. You needed to learn those lessons without the distraction of deference to my background. Colonel Patterson, still processing the implications, asked, "Colonel Reeves, the tactical coordination we witnessed today, was that representative of your actual capabilities?" "Today's exercise was basic small unit tactics, Colonel Patterson. The missions I've led involve significantly more complex operational parameters, often in environments where failure meant not just mission failure, but the loss of American lives." As if to emphasize her words, the sound of helicopter rotors intensified outside. Through the windows, they could see personnel in full combat gear approaching the building with the urgent efficiency of an operational deployment. "Colonel Reeves," General Hawthorne said formally, "your transport team is ready for departure." Colonel Reeves nodded and turned back to the cadets. "I'm being reactivated for an emergency mission. 12 American service members are being held hostage in conditions that require my specific expertise to rescue successfully." The weight of that statement settled over the room. While they'd been complaining about training exercises and academic instruction, their teacher had been someone capable of planning and executing real rescue missions where American lives hung in the balance. Nash raised his hand slowly. "Ma'am, the mission you're going on, is it dangerous?" Colonel Reeves met his gaze directly. "All special operations missions carry significant risk, Cadet Nash. But my team and I have successfully completed similar operations before. We know what we're doing." Foster, who had been silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke up. "Colonel, what happens to us while you're gone? Do we continue training?" "Your training will continue under Sergeant Mitchell and the other instructors. When I return, we'll discuss what you've learned from today's events and how it applies to your development as future military leaders." The casual confidence with which she said, "when I return," rather than "if I return," spoke volumes about her professional competence and experience. This wasn't someone hoping to survive a dangerous mission. This was someone who had executed similar operations successfully many times before. A knock on the briefing room door interrupted the discussion. A soldier in full combat gear entered and approached Colonel Reeves. "Ma'am, we're ready for immediate departure. Mission. Planning materials are loaded and transport is standing by." Colonel Reeves nodded and turned to address the cadets one final time. "I want each of you to think carefully about what you've learned today, not just about my background, but about your own assumptions, your treatment of others, and what real leadership looks like." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "You spent months questioning my qualifications and competence based on surface appearances and preconceived notions. That kind of judgment error could get people killed in real military operations." Jackson stood up slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "Colonel Reeves, ma'am, I owe you a formal apology. My behavior was inexcusable, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you." One by one, the other cadets began standing, each offering their own apologies and expressions of regret. The transformation in their attitudes was complete. The arrogant teenagers who had mocked their instructor for months now stood before one of the most accomplished military officers any of them had ever met. Colonel Reeves accepted their apologies with the grace of someone who had expected this moment from the beginning. "Your apologies are accepted, cadets, but more importantly, I hope you've learned something valuable about leadership, respect, and the danger of making assumptions about people based on limited information." She moved toward the door, then turned back one final time. "When I return, we're going to have extensive discussions about what happened here today and how it applies to your future roles as military leaders. Think about what you want to say." As she reached the door, Williams called out, "Colonel Reeves, ma'am, good luck with the mission." She smiled. the first genuine smile any of them had seen from her during her entire time at the academy. "Thank you, Cadet Williams. I'll see you all when I get back." And with that, Colonel Diane Reeves walked out of the briefing room and toward a helicopter that would take her back into the world of classified operations and life-or-death missions, leaving behind 23 cadets who finally understood exactly who they had been learning from all along. The quiet instructor they had dismissed as irrelevant was about to risk her life to save American service members in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The 48 hours that followed Colonel Reeves's departure were unlike anything in Thunderhawk Academy's history. Word of the revelation had spread through the entire institution with lightning speed, creating an atmosphere of shock, introspection, and barely contained anticipation as everyone waited for news of the mission she'd been called to lead. General Hawthorne had extended her inspection visit, partly out of professional curiosity about the Academy's classified training program, but mostly because she wanted to be present when Colonel Reeves returned. She spent those 2 days conducting extensive interviews with Academy staff and cadets, piecing together a complete picture of how one of the military's most elite special operations officers had spent 8 months being systematically underestimated and disrespected. "It's the most sophisticated deep cover training assessment I've ever encountered," she told Colonel Patterson during a private briefing. Colonel Reeves wasn't just teaching these cadets tactical theory. She was conducting a comprehensive evaluation of their character, leadership potential, and ability to recognize competence when it doesn't come with obvious credentials. The cadets themselves were struggling to process the magnitude of their misjudgment. Jackson had barely eaten or slept since learning the truth, spending hours walking the academy grounds and replaying every interaction he'd had with Colonel Reeves over the past 8 months. The weight of his disrespectful behavior toward someone who had risked her life saving American service members was almost unbearable. Rodriguez had called his parents to confess what had happened, breaking down over the phone as he described how he'd mocked and dismissed a decorated war hero for months. "She let us think she was weak," he told his father through tears, "but she was protecting us the whole time, protecting us from knowing how badly we were failing as human beings." Morrison had thrown himself into researching everything he could find about Army Special Forces operations, trying to understand the world his instructor came from. The classified nature of her specific missions meant that details were scarce, but he'd learned enough about special operations to realize that Colonel Reeves moved in circles far beyond anything he'd ever imagined. Williams, who had been the most observant of the group, was conducting his own investigation into the signs he'd missed. "She was always watching," he told Torres during one of their late-night discussions. "Always positioned where she could see exits, always aware of everyone's location. She moved like someone expecting trouble because that's how she stayed alive in places where trouble meant death." The Academy's other instructors were dealing with their own professional embarrassment. Sergeant Mitchell had reviewed every training session where Colonel Reeves had offered suggestions or corrections, realizing that he'd been receiving tactical guidance from someone whose expertise far exceeded his own. "She could have taken over any exercise, shown us all up, proven her superiority whenever she wanted," he told Dr. Foster. "Instead, she let us maintain our authority while quietly making us better instructors." Dr. Foster herself was, perhaps, the most shaken by the revelation. Her dismissive comments about academic theory versus real-world application had been directed at someone whose real-world experience included operations in the most dangerous places on Earth. "I was lecturing her about the difference between theory and practice," she said to General Hawthorne with bitter irony, while she was sitting there having actually done things I could only read about in classified briefings. The maintenance worker, Henry Kowalski, had become something of a celebrity among the staff. His observations about Colonel Reeves's behavior patterns had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible. 30 years of military service teaches you to recognize certain things, he told anyone who would listen. She moved like someone who'd been in serious combat, not like someone who'd just read about it. On the second day, Colonel Patterson received a classified communication providing limited details about the mission Colonel Reeves had been called to lead. The information was restricted, but he was authorized to share general parameters with General Hawthorne and senior Academy staff. The operation was successful, he announced during an emergency staff meeting. All 12 hostages were rescued alive, with minimal casualties to opposition forces. The mission was executed with what Pentagon operations described as textbook precision and tactical excellence. Relief flooded through the assembled staff, but the professional implications were staggering. They'd just learned that their quiet instructor had successfully led one of the most complex rescue operations conducted by American forces in recent years. "There's more," Colonel Patterson continued. Colonel Reeves specifically requested that the Academy be informed of the mission's outcome because she wanted the cadets to understand that the skills she'd been trying to teach them had direct application to real-world operations where American lives were at stake. General Hawthorne nodded thoughtfully. She's still teaching them, even from a classified operational environment. This woman is remarkable. The third day brought news that Colonel Reeves would be returning to the Academy that evening, but with a significant change in her status. Her temporary civilian assignment was being converted to a permanent position as Director of Advanced Tactical Training, with full authority to redesign the Academy's curriculum based on her operational experience. The Pentagon has decided that her cover assignment served its purpose, Colonel Patterson explained to the assembled cadets. She's proven that current training methods need significant improvement, and she's being authorized to implement changes based on real-world special operations requirements. Jackson raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, does that mean she'll continue teaching us?" "It means she'll be teaching all of you, but from her actual position of authority, rather than maintaining the fiction of being a civilian instructor. You'll be learning from one of the most experienced special operations officers in the military, and she'll expect performance standards appropriate to that level of instruction." The implications were both exciting and terrifying. They'd be receiving training directly from someone whose expertise had been proven in the most demanding operational environments, but they'd also be held to standards that reflected that expertise. Torres looked nervous. "Sir, after how we treated her, will she even want to continue working with us?" Colonel Patterson smiled. "Cadet Torres, Colonel Reeves specifically requested to continue your instruction. She said that your honest reactions to her cover identity provided valuable insights into cadet psychology and leadership development. She views the entire experience as a successful training evolution for everyone involved." As evening approached, the cadets gathered at the Academy's main entrance to await their instructor's return. The atmosphere was a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and profound respect for someone they now understood they'd never really known at all. Cadet Williams had prepared a formal apology speech on behalf of the entire class, but as they waited, Jackson spoke up with quiet determination. "We need to do more than apologize," he said. "We need to prove that we learned something from this, that we're better cadets and better people because of what she taught us, even when we didn't realize we were being taught." The others nodded in agreement. The woman returning to them wasn't the same person who had left. She was Colonel Diane Reeves, proven in combat and recognized by the highest levels of military command as irreplaceable. But more importantly, she was someone who had seen their worst qualities and still chosen to continue believing in their potential. As the sound of approaching helicopters filled the air, 23 cadets stood at attention with a respect and understanding they'd never possessed before. They were about to welcome back not just their instructor, but one of the most accomplished military heroes any of them would ever have the privilege to learn from. The quiet woman they'd dismissed as incompetent was returning as the decorated special operations officer she'd always been, and their education was about to begin in earnest. The helicopter carrying Colonel Reeves touched down at Thunderhawk Academy just as the sun was setting over the Colorado mountains, its rotors creating a whirlwind of dust and debris that forced the assembled cadets to shield their eyes. When the aircraft's engines finally wound down and the side door slid open, the woman who stepped out bore little resemblance to the hesitant instructor who had left 3 days earlier. Colonel Diane Reeves wore full military dress uniform with ribbons and decorations that told the story of a distinguished career most of the cadets were only beginning to understand. The Distinguished Service Cross gleamed prominently among her awards, flanked by multiple Bronze Stars, Purple Hearts, and commendations that represented years of service in the most dangerous places on Earth. Her bearing was that of someone who had just successfully completed one of the most challenging missions of her career and was ready to return to the business of training the next generation of military leaders. General Hawthorne stepped forward to greet her formally. Colonel Reeves, on behalf of Thunderhawk Academy and the Western Military District, welcome back. Congratulations on a successful mission. Thank you, General. It's good to be back. Colonel Reeves's voice carried a warmth that hadn't been present during her previous incarnation as a civilian instructor, but also an authority that made every cadet unconsciously straighten to attention. Colonel Patterson approached next, extending his hand with obvious respect. Colonel, we've prepared quarters appropriate to your new rank and position. Your office has been established in the command building, and we're ready to discuss curriculum modifications whenever you're prepared. I appreciate that, Colonel Patterson, but first I need to address my cadets. We have some important matters to discuss. The 23 young men and women who had spent months dismissing her as incompetent now stood in perfect formation, their eyes fixed on a woman they finally understood they'd never really known. The transformation in their demeanor was complete. Gone was the casual disrespect and barely concealed contempt, replaced by the kind of respectful attention reserved for superior officers who had proven themselves in combat. Colonel Reeves walked slowly down the line of cadets, making eye contact with each one. When she reached Jackson, she paused. "Cadet Jackson, you have something to say." Jackson's voice was steady but thick with emotion. "Ma'am, on behalf of the entire cadet class, I want to formally apologize for our treatment of you over the past 8 months. We were wrong about you, wrong about ourselves, and wrong about what leadership looks like. We failed as cadets, as future officers, and as human beings." "And what do you think you learned from that failure, Cadet Jackson?" The question hung in the air as Jackson struggled to find words adequate to express the magnitude of his realization. "Ma'am, we learned that competence doesn't always announce itself, that real strength is often quiet, that we were so focused on looking for leadership that matched our expectations that we completely missed excellence that didn't fit our preconceptions." Colonel Reeves nodded thoughtfully. "Continue." "We learned that respect should be earned through observation of character and competence, not granted based on rank or reputation. And we learned that our own arrogance blinded us to lessons we desperately needed to learn." Rodriguez stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, we also learned that we have a lot of growing up to do before we're worthy of leading soldiers in combat. You've been preparing us for responsibilities we didn't even understand we were training for." "Cadet Rodriguez, what makes you say that?" "Ma'am, the mission you just completed, 12 American lives depended on your expertise, and leadership. Someday, other people's sons and daughters might depend on the decisions we make. We weren't ready for that responsibility 8 months ago, and we're barely beginning to understand it now. Morrison joined the conversation, his voice quiet but determined. Colonel Reeves, ma'am, we want to ask for something beyond forgiveness. We want the chance to prove that we can be the kind of cadets and future officers who deserve the training you can provide. Colonel Reeves studied the faces before her, seeing the genuine remorse and determination that had replaced the casual arrogance of 8 months earlier. And what would that look like, Cadet Morrison? Ma'am, we want to start over, not pretending that the past 8 months didn't happen, but using what we learned about ourselves to become better. We want you to train us the way you would train special operations personnel, because we understand now that anything less would be a disservice to the people we might someday be responsible for. Williams stepped forward with the formal apology speech he'd prepared, but Colonel Reeves held up a hand. Cadet Williams, I can see you've prepared remarks, but I'm more interested in actions than words at this point. Ma'am, what actions would demonstrate that we've learned from our mistakes? That's something you'll need to figure out yourselves. Real leadership means taking responsibility for your own development and the development of those around you. I can provide training, guidance, and expertise, but I can't make you into the officers you need to become. That's work you have to do yourselves. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several Academy staff members, including Dr. Foster, who approached with obvious nervousness. Colonel Reeves, I owe you a personal and professional apology. My comments about theoretical knowledge versus practical experience were completely inappropriate, and I'm embarrassed by my failure to recognize your expertise. Dr. Foster, your observations about the gap between theory and practice were actually quite valuable. The difference is that I was able to observe that gap from both sides. As someone who had extensive practical experience and was learning about academic approaches to military instruction, Sergeant Mitchell joined the group, his usual commanding presence somewhat subdued. Ma'am, I want to say that your tactical suggestions during training exercises were consistently excellent, and I regret not giving them the attention they deserved. Sergeant Mitchell, you maintained proper command authority during training exercises, which was exactly what you should have done. My role was to observe and assess, not to undermine your instructional authority. General Hawthorne observed these exchanges with professional fascination. Colonel Reeves, I have to ask, was this entire assignment a deliberate psychological assessment of Academy personnel and training methods? Partially, General. My assignment had multiple objectives, including the development of new training protocols, assessment of current instructional methods, and evaluation of how cadets respond to different types of leadership and authority. Colonel Patterson looked intrigued. And what were your conclusions? The cadets showed exactly the kind of behavior I would expect from intelligent, motivated young people who haven't yet learned to distinguish between confidence and arrogance, or between strength and aggression. They needed to learn that real leadership often comes from unexpected sources, and that competence doesn't always conform to their expectations. She turned back to the assembled cadets. But more importantly, you needed to learn about yourselves, how you respond to authority you don't respect, how you treat people you perceive as weaker than yourselves, and how your assumptions can blind you to opportunities to learn and grow. Torres raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, what happens now? Do we continue training under your instruction? That depends entirely on you, Cadet Torres. I'm prepared to provide training that will challenge you in ways you haven't yet experienced. But that training will require a level of commitment, discipline, and personal growth that goes far beyond anything you've demonstrated so far. Nash looked nervous but determined. Ma'am, what would that training involve? Colonel Reeves smiled. Not the patient, accommodating smile they'd grown accustomed to, but the confident expression of someone who had just been given permission to do what she did best. Cadet Nash, you're about to learn what it means to be trained by someone who has led real operations in real combat. You're going to be challenged physically, mentally, and emotionally in ways that will either make you into exceptional military officers or convince you that you belong in a different profession. The promise was both exciting and terrifying. The woman standing before them had just proven her expertise in the most demanding operational environment possible, and now she was offering to share that expertise with cadets who finally understood what an extraordinary opportunity they were being given. But first, she continued, you need to understand something important. The person you've been learning from for 8 months was the real me, the quiet instructor who accepted your disrespect without retaliation, who continued teaching even when you weren't interested in learning, who saw potential in you even when you couldn't see it in yourselves. That was Colonel Diane Reeves, not some fictional character I was playing. Jackson looked confused. Ma'am, I don't understand. The qualities you dismissed as weakness, patience, restraint, the ability to remain calm under pressure, the willingness to put the mission above personal ego, those are exactly the qualities that make special operations possible. You've been learning from them all along. You just didn't recognize what you were seeing. The realization hit the cadets like a physical force. Everything they had interpreted as weakness or incompetence had actually been demonstrations of the exact qualities they would need to develop as military leaders. Their instructor hadn't been hiding her strength. She'd been showing them what real strength looked like, and they'd been too blinded by their preconceptions to recognize it. Your real education, Colonel Reeves concluded, is about to begin. 6 months later, Thunderhawk Academy had been transformed into something unprecedented in military education. Under Colonel Reeves's direction as the newly appointed Director of Advanced Tactical Training, the institution had become a proving ground for revolutionary approaches to leadership development and special operations preparation. The changes weren't just cosmetic. They represented a fundamental shift in how the military thought about training future officers. The Academy's new motto, displayed prominently at the entrance, read, "Strength in silence, wisdom in observation, excellence without ego." It served as a daily reminder of the lessons learned during those crucial 8 months when appearance and reality had been so dramatically misaligned. The cadets who had once mocked their instructor now formed the Academy's most elite training unit, known informally as Reeves's Regiment. Their transformation had been so complete and their performance so exceptional that they'd become a model for military academies across the country. But more importantly, they had developed into the kind of leaders who could recognize competence regardless of how it was packaged. Jackson, now the senior cadet leader, stood before a group of newly arrived first-year students, delivering an orientation briefing that had become legendary throughout the military education system. "You're about to be taught by Colonel Diane Reeves," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned hard lessons about leadership and respect. "She will probably not look like what you expect a special operations hero to look like. She will not announce her credentials or demand your respect based on her rank or achievements. She will simply be excellent at everything she does, and it will be up to you to recognize that excellence and learn from it." The new cadets listened with the kind of attention that comes from hearing stories that seem almost too incredible to believe. The tale of how an entire class had spent months disrespecting one of the military's most decorated special operations officers had spread throughout the armed forces, becoming required reading at leadership schools, and a cautionary tale about the danger of assumptions. "Your first test," Jackson continued, "will not be physical or academic. It will be whether you can recognize competence when it doesn't conform to your expectations. Some of the strongest people you'll ever meet will speak quietly. Some of the most accomplished warriors will prefer teaching to fighting. Some of the most valuable lessons will come from people you might initially underestimate. Rodriguez, now Jackson's deputy, added his own perspective. We learned that real leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the most obviously impressive person present. It's about competence, character, and the ability to make other people better. Colonel Reeves taught us that through her actions, not her words, and we were too arrogant to see it until we almost lost the opportunity to learn from her. The academic curriculum itself had been revolutionized. Colonel Reeves had integrated real-world operational scenarios with theoretical instruction, creating training exercises that challenged cadets to think like actual special operations personnel rather than students playing military games. The obstacle course that had once seemed impossible was now regularly completed by cadets in times that would have been competitive with active-duty Special Forces personnel. But the most significant change was cultural. The atmosphere of competitive arrogance that had characterized the academy for decades had been replaced by a collaborative environment where cadets were expected to recognize and develop each other's strengths rather than exploit weaknesses. Bullying, mockery, and the kind of casual disrespect that had once been tolerated were now grounds for immediate dismissal. Dr. Foster, whose own transformation had been as dramatic as the cadets, had become Colonel Reeves's closest collaborator in developing new pedagogical approaches. We learned that academic knowledge and practical experience aren't opposing forces, she told visiting educators. They're complementary tools that become more powerful when properly integrated. Colonel Reeves showed us how to combine theoretical understanding with operational expertise in ways that produce better soldiers and better human beings. The Academy's reputation had spread far beyond military circles. Corporate leadership programs, police academies, and even civilian educational institutions were sending representatives to study the Thunderhawk method of recognizing and developing hidden potential. The central principle that competence often comes in unexpected packages and that true leadership requires the humility to learn from anyone had applications far beyond military training. General Hawthorne, who had been promoted and now oversaw special operations training for the entire military, made regular visits to observe the program she had witnessed during its crucial early days. What Colonel Reeves created here isn't just a training program, she told Pentagon officials. It's a new paradigm for how we identify and develop leadership potential. She's proven that our traditional assumptions about what warriors look like and how they behave are often completely wrong. The most visible symbol of the Academy's transformation was the memorial wall in the main building, dedicated to the 12 service members Colonel Reeves had rescued during her emergency reactivation. But beneath their names was an inscription that captured the deeper lesson. In honor of those who serve in silence, lead without fanfare, and find strength in humility. Excellence speaks for itself to those willing to listen. Morrison, now preparing for graduation and assignment to an elite unit, reflected on the journey during a private conversation with Colonel Reeves. Ma'am, I keep thinking about how different everything could have been if we'd just paid attention from the beginning. How much more we could have learned, how much better we could have been. Colonel Reeves smiled with the patience that had always been her hallmark. Cadet Morrison, you learned exactly what you needed to learn when you needed to learn it. The experience of misjudging someone and discovering your error is often more valuable than getting it right from the beginning. Humility that comes from recognizing your own mistakes is more powerful than humility that's never been tested. Williams, who had developed into one of the Academy's most perceptive leaders, added, "Ma'am, Do you think we would have become the same people if you'd revealed your background from the first day? No, Cadet Williams, you wouldn't have. You needed to encounter your own prejudices and assumptions in order to overcome them. You needed to experience the consequences of dismissing someone based on surface appearances, so you'd never make that mistake when lives depend on your judgment. The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the Academy's communication system. All personnel, attention. We have incoming transport with VIP passengers requesting immediate assembly for a special presentation. As the cadets and staff gathered in the main courtyard, a convoy of vehicles arrived carrying officials from the Pentagon, including the Secretary of the Army and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The visit was unannounced, which usually meant something significant was about to happen. The Secretary stepped forward to address the assembled Academy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to announce that Thunderhawk Academy's Advanced Tactical Training Program has been selected for expansion to all military academies nationwide. Colonel Reeves's methods have proven so effective that they're being adopted as the new standard for leadership development throughout the armed forces. The announcement was met with pride and satisfaction from the Academy personnel, but Colonel Reeves herself seemed more interested in the continued development of her current cadets than in the recognition of her achievements. Colonel Reeves, the chairman continued, you've done something remarkable here. You've proven that our assumptions about leadership development were limiting our potential. You've shown us that the best warriors often don't look like what we expect warriors to look like, and that the most valuable lessons often come from the most unexpected sources. As the ceremonies concluded and the VIP visitors departed, the Academy settled into its new normal, a place where excellence was expected regardless of its appearance, where strength was measured by character rather than volume, and where the most important lesson was that everyone has something valuable to teach, if you're humble enough to learn. Jackson stood with his fellow cadets as evening formation concluded, watching Colonel Reeves return to her office to prepare for another day of teaching lessons that went far beyond military tactics. You know what's amazing, he said to the group. She's still teaching us, every day, not just about tactics or strategy, but about how to be better people. Torres nodded in agreement, and the best part is, she's doing it the same way she always did, quietly, patiently, leading by example rather than demanding attention. As darkness fell over the Colorado mountains, the lights in Colonel Reeves's office remained on, illuminating her work on developing new training protocols that would benefit cadets she would never meet at academies she would never visit. The quiet instructor who had once been dismissed as irrelevant was now reshaping how an entire nation developed its military leaders. The woman they had almost failed to recognize was still changing lives, one lesson at a time, proving every day that the most extraordinary people are often hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone wise enough to see beyond appearances and humble enough to learn from unexpected teachers. Excellence, as it turned out, really did speak for itself, but only to those who had learned to listen. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.